I rise to strongly oppose H.R. 1062. This bill places significant additional requirements for economic analysis by the Securities and Exchange Commission, effectively bringing any efforts at rulemaking to a standstill. Let's be clear. The purpose of this legislative effort is to stop implementation of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act dead in its tracks. After losing in Congress, the fight against the Dodd-Frank Act moved to the courts, beginning with overturning the proxy access rules they adopted under authority provided by that act. Although I agreed fully with the SEC's position, they went with their friends to court, and the court found that the SEC did not meet its already significant requirements to conduct an economic analysis. After the proxy access case was overturned, the SEC adopted improved standards for conducting cost-benefit analysis. These procedures were cited by the GAO just last December as having all of the elements of good regulatory analysis. Basically what the GAO is saying, we took a look, we studied, and they do a good job. Nonetheless, the bill before us today adds even more requirements, tying up the SEC resources and putting it at even greater risk of litigation for every rule. Despite the assurances of my Republican colleagues that they're only applying the terms of an executive order to the SEC, that executive order explicitly protects agencies from lawsuits based on their economic analysis. H.R. 1062 has no such protection for the SEC. The Commission is undertaking a valiant effort to finish the Dodd-Frank and Jobs Act rules, even in the face of attempts by the majority to restrict their funding. As the SEC attempts to balance capital formation with the need to protect investors, this bill weights the scales heavily in favor of industry over investors. In fact, the words investor protection do not appear anywhere in this bill. Even without this bill, we can count on industry lobbyists to sue the SEC anytime it sees a weakness in the justification supporting a rule, as they have in several other cases currently before the courts. And this bill does not apply only to new rules. This is extraordinary, and I want to say this so everybody understands. This bill would require the Commission to review every rulemaking ever issued, even those that have protected our securities markets since the Great Depression, 1 year after the adoption of this bill, and then again every 5 years thereafter. As a result, the Commission will be forced to divert resources away from other key areas, such as enforcement. This comes at a time when House Republicans want to hold SEC funding flat, despite the SEC's new responsibilities. The increase in the number of participants it oversees, and the growth of complexity and the size of U.S. securities markets. It is ironic that as House Republicans push this bill forward, they are also calling for the SEC to speed up its efforts on Jobs Act rules. This bill makes it impossible for the SEC to meet the very deadline we adopted just 2 days ago when we passed H.R. 701. I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 1062, and I thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from California reserves. For what purpose the gentleman from Texas rise?
I'll yield myself 30 seconds,
Gentleman's recognized
Mr. Chairman.
For 30 seconds.
Just to say that, number one, in listening to my colleague, the ranking member, I'm just curious about this concern about litigation burdens. We certainly didn't see it as she and many of her colleagues backed the proxy access rule, and how many have refused to support medical liability reform. So I don't understand why the litigation burden concern is not there. In addition, I noticed that the SEC has sought comment in the past on rulemaking to ensure that there is a retrospective look back because markets change. At this time, Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 5 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets and GSEs of the Financial Services Committee. The author of the legislation, Mr. Garrett of New Jersey, 5 minutes.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank the gentleman, and I rise today obviously in support of H.R. 1062, the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act. You know, at a time when new regulation after new regulation is being proposed by this administration, it is critical that we restore some semblance of order to the regulatory process and ensure that our nation's small businesses do not continue to drown in a sea of red tape. So this legislation specifically subjects the SEC to a more robust version of the President's own order, which requires and outlines an enhanced cost-benefit analysis requirements, as well as requires a review of existing regulations. The SEC Regulatory Accountability Act will do what? It will enhance the SEC's existing economic analysis requirements, requiring the Commission to first clearly identify the nature of the problem that would be addressed before issuing any new regulations. And while the SEC has already certain cost-benefits related requirements in current law relative to rulemaking, as indicated before, recent court decisions have vacated or remanded several of these and have pointed out the deficiencies in the Commission's use of cost-benefit analysis. For example, recently the SEC Inspector General issued a report that expressed several concerns about the quality of their analysis. It found that none of the rulemaking it examined attempted to quantify either benefits or costs other than informational collection cost. This bill will ensure that the benefits of any rulemaking outweigh the costs, and that both new and existing regulations are accessible, consistent, written in plain language, and easy to understand. The legislation will also require the SEC to assess the cost and benefits to available regulatory alternatives, including the alternative not regulating at all, and to choose the approach that basically gives us the best benefits. Under the bill, the SEC shall evaluate whether a proposed regulation is inconsistent, incompatible, or duplicative of other federal regulations as well. So because some rulemaking has been politicized in the past, the bill then requires that this cost-benefit analysis in which I talk about will be performed by who? By the Commission's chief economist. So these are common sense reforms. They are appropriate, especially given the fact that the Commission continues to struggle with this issue. For instance, as already pointed out, in the recent unanimous decision of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which vacated the Commission's proxy access rule, the Court stated, quote, "The Commission acted arbitrarily and capriciously for having failed once again to adequately assess the economic benefits of a new rule and acted inconsistently and opportunistically in framing cost and benefits of the rule." So the bill also includes, besides all this, a section that will provide a clearer post-implementation assessment of new regulations so that post-implementation cost-benefit analysis can also be done, in addition to the pre-implementation. This will be able to better inform the true impact of the major rules once they're in place. Now, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say these new requirements will be too costly and will open the SEC to a flood of additional lawsuits. No. This could be further from the truth. See, by having these robust standards, the rules will be drafted so that, well, that they will be thoroughly done. They will not be struck down by the courts, and will not have to wade through additional time and money defending them in court and then redrafting the rules like the proxy access rule. So in the end, this is a common-sense, pragmatic approach to our rulemaking process that should have been in place all along. And with our economy struggling now with unemployment above 7.5%, we need to ensure that we're making it easier, not harder, for businesses to begin hiring again. Clearly, Mr. Chairman, a stronger commitment to economic analysis by the SEC is absolutely essential to ensure reasonable rules do not unduly burden registered companies or negatively impact job creation. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose is the gentlelady from California?
I yield to the gentlelady from New York, 2 minutes.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the lady for yielding and for her leadership. Mr. Speaker, I strongly oppose this bill because I believe it would in effect cripple the SEC, just as it undertakes the immense task of implementing the essential Dodd-Frank reforms. May I remind my colleagues that this country lost $12 trillion, according to some estimates, and it happened in part because regulators like the SEC were ill-equipped, underfunded, and did too little, too slowly. The Republican bill comes in the guise of requiring the SEC to undertake a cost-benefit analysis of regulations, but it is really a prescription of paralysis of the SEC's ability to protect our investors and our markets. There is already a multi-layered and highly effective cost-benefit analysis built into the SEC rulemaking process. Just look at the recent D.C. Circuit case, where the court overturned an SEC proxy access rule and sent a message back to the SEC reminding them of all the cost-benefit analysis that they are required to do now by law. And they stated they will vacate any rule if this is not done. Already there is analysis required under the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Congressional Review Act, and the Regulatory Flexibility Act. And just for the SEC alone, in 1996, we passed the National Securities Market Improvement Act requiring a cost-benefit analysis. It is already there. It is on the books, and it is enforced by our courts. So what is before us today? A hurdle. Let's do more. Let's require them to go back to 1933, review every rule, so they cannot do their important work of protecting the American taxpayer and our economy of derivatives fraud, and other abuses to investors.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
I'm just warming up, but I think my colleagues have a lot to say. It is a prescription for paralysis.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
I urge a no vote
Unless the
for
gentleman from California
investor
wishes to yield
protection.
additional time. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 10 seconds just to say to my friend from New York that if this regime is so effective, why was there a unanimous decision of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals to say it was ineffective? And if it's already on the books, then the worst thing that we have done is that we are being repetitive. I don't think that's such a great sin.
Will the gentleman yield?
Will
the gentleman yield?
To the gentleman from Virginia, the Vice Chairman of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Mr. Hurt.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the Chairman for yielding. Thank him for his leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in strong support of the bill that's being offered by Mr. Garrett. This is a bill that will ensure the SEC will abide by simple cost-benefit analysis requirements. All federal agencies, but especially the SEC, affect the efficiency and success of our Main Street businesses across Virginia's 5th District and all across this country. The SEC primarily exists to protect investors, maintain fair and efficient markets, and to facilitate capital formation. This positions the Commission as a critical component of our small businesses' ability to access the capital they need to grow jobs. If access to capital continues to be constrained by overly burdensome regulations, we will not see the economic growth and the jobs that we need in my district and across the United States. While it is critical that the SEC be able to promulgate certain rules to implement congressional legislation, it is also critical that Congress clearly set forth its legislative prerogatives. As members of Congress, we must ensure that the rules that the SEC adopts are with good purpose and that they are not unduly adding more burdens on hardworking Americans at a time when our economy is struggling. Indeed, I believe that all federal agencies should be held accountable by the Congress to ensure that the cost of the rules that they promulgate will not be greater than the benefit of those rules to the American people. Congressional oversight is our constitutional responsibility, and I'm proud to support this legislation to ensure that excessive federal regulations are not unnecessarily hindering job creation at a time when the people across Virginia's 5th District need jobs the most. I urge passage of this good bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I yield to the gentlelady from Wisconsin's Representative Gwen Moore. 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentlelady. Just let me say that a 2013 GOA study estimated that the financial crisis cost the U.S. economy a total of more than $22 trillion, a crisis brought on by Wall Street deregulation that allowed firms and markets to operate unchecked and without accountability. Supporters of this bill seek to ignore those lessons and bind the SEC to the myopic vision of deregulation that was completely discredited when it nearly caused a second depression. This bill raises intractable hurdles to regulation, making it impossible to protect investors even in the presence of fraud. Instead, this bill requires the SEC to eliminate accountability for market participants despite the systemic risk that it imposes. Now, my dear colleagues on the other side, I've heard them wax on and on and on about a cost-benefit analysis. This bill focuses totally on the cost to market participants and talks nothing about the benefits of the SEC regulation in protecting investors and avoiding systemic risk. Nothing about the value of preventing another financial meltdown. Republicans' cost-benefit rhetoric on this bill cloaks its reality, which is that this bill benefits Wall Street and costs taxpayers. Wall Street bemoans all regulations as too costly, yet they keep posting record profits and keep paying record bonuses. I urge all my colleagues to support those hurt by the financial crisis and vote against this legislation. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Frog Jump, Tennessee, Mr. Fincher.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act. Title I of the Jobs Act was so important for smaller companies trying to go public because a lot of regulations come with the IPO process. If more and more of a company's resources have to be dedicated to government regulations, the company can't expand and create jobs. That's why we need a balanced approach to legislation, to regulations. Before I make any major decision, like every hard-working taxpayer, I use common sense. I evaluate that effect that decision will have on me, my bank account, my family, and so on. Why shouldn't the federal government ask itself those same questions? Shouldn't the SEC question if a regulation is good for business? Does it help capital formation? Will it do more harm than good, or vice versa? All we're asking the SEC to do is a simple economic analysis before issuing a potentially expensive regulatory action. I encourage my colleagues to join with me in supporting the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I yield to the gentleman from Minnesota, Representative Ellison, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 2 minutes.
You know, Mr. Speaker, we hear folks mentioning the need for families to have gas and pay medical bills and pay groceries. But wait a minute. Didn't the Wall Street reform crisis of 2008 nearly destroy the American economy? Didn't it lead to 4 million foreclosures? Didn't it nearly wipe out billions of dollars in home value? Didn't it do all these things? And oh wait, didn't we see Wall Street fraudster Bernie Madoff rip off billions from investors and charities and retirees, and something that the SEC has jurisdiction over? So then why now are we undermining Wall Street reform and the ability of the SEC to protect investors? Why are we gumming up the works and making it so much more difficult? I mean, the ink is barely dry on the bill, and they're already at deconstructing it. Interesting article I would commend all of us to take a look at. It's called He Who Makes the Rules. Barack Obama's biggest second-term challenge isn't guns or immigration. It's saving the biggest first-term achievements like Dodd-Frank reform law from being dismembered by lobbyists and conservative jurists in the shadowy Byzantine rulemaking process by Haley Edwards. The fact is that what's going on here, we know what the game is. There's nothing to do with groceries or medical bills. It's about Wall Street's interests in it trying to expand even more in the area of bonuses and profitability, which it has so much of already. Banks are enjoying their largest profits in history, and yet we're considering a bill that would undermine landmark Wall Street reform. This bill undermines financial security for the American people and the economy. Now, the lawsuits, you know, I am a firm believer in the American process of civil redress. But I also know that you can kick the door open and use strategic lawsuits simply to slow down and gum up the works. It's clear that that would be the effect of this particular piece of legislation, which is duplicative and which is unnecessary. Vote no on
Gentleman
H.R.
from
1062.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of H.R. 1062, the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act. Mr. Chairman, we're coming out and still in the worst recession recovery since the 1930s. Our economic growth is at an anemic 2.5%, and we can't continue like this. It's all because we've got a very burdensome regulatory environment. What we need, Mr. Chairman, is a Reagan recovery, one where they lifted the burdensome and unnecessary regulations and allowed businesses to grow and to create jobs, while in 1 month alone, over 1 million jobs were created. That's why I support the Regulatory Accountability Act. It's very simple. It just requires a cost analysis of new legislation and new requirements for businesses before they're implemented, and then post-adoptive analysis after they've been put in effect. Mr. Chairman, we have 59 economists at the SEC today and 1,750 attorneys, all trying to justify their careers with new regulations that they're writing all the time. This has got to change. We need a positive business climate that will bring us out of the bondage of Washington micromanagement and allow hardworking Americans to create better jobs and find better jobs to support their families and provide for them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I release the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Connecticut, Representative Hines, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Ranking Member, and thank you for your leadership of our side on this committee. Mr. Chair, I rise in opposition to H.R. 1062 and find it curious that Chairman Hensarling, a man for whom I have a great deal of respect, frames this legislation in the context of the huge impact that financial regulation is supposedly having on jobs in his district and jobs in this country. Mr. Chairman, I've read all the economic reports from the Federal Reserve to economists on the left and the right, and not one of them says that our economy is recovering slowly because of financial regulation. They talk about the austerity, they talk about the sequester as meaningfully reducing the number of jobs in this country. By the way, policies that Chairman Hensarling's party has supported from moment one. They talk about Europe, they talk about housing, they talk about inadequate demand. Nobody says that financial regulation is materially impeding our recovery. Curious that that's on the table. Curious also that 2 days ago this House passes legislation to urge the SEC to speed up, not urge, demand that the SEC speed up its rule writing on the Jobs Act. And today we're here to pass a measure that would actually slow down the SEC. Curious. Why is that? Curious that the other side, my friends on the Republican Party, have consistently sought to underfund the SEC at the very moment in history where we have added dramatically to their purview. The derivatives market, mortgage market, they now must regulate, and yet in 2011, when they were first to assume these responsibilities, the Republicans sought to cut the SEC budget by $300 million against what it was ultimately paid for. So what is really happening? If I may quote the chairman, what is this really about? None of that makes sense. What this is really about is an ongoing ideological effort to tie the regulatory agencies up by cutting their budgets, by refusing to confirm their leadership, by imposing litigation hurdles and cost-benefit analysis ad nauseum such that they cannot do their job. And if they can't do their job, this country loses jobs. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, the chairman of the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Subcommittee, Mr. Crenshaw.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for the time and thank Mr. Garrett for bringing this important piece of legislation before the House today. As chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Financial Services, my subcommittee has oversight for the budget of the SEC. And I think the members would be interested in knowing that that budget has increased over 200% in the last decade. And the SEC this year is asking for a substantial increase, more than most agencies. And so I think if that is the case, that it's important that the SEC spend the money that they receive in the right way, and that they set the right priorities. And it seems to me that if rules and regulations are important and they're necessary, then the cornerstone of that rulemaking process should be what kind of impact is that going to have on the people of this country? What kind of impact, this far-reaching impact, is it going to have? And how much does that cost? And what are the benefits? Now, so far, the SEC hasn't quite gotten that right. The Inspector General has said that. Courts have said that. And all this bill does is simply say to the SEC what we would all agree is common sense. It's not a partisan idea. It's not a Democratic idea, Republican idea. It just says...
Gentleman from Texas.
I yield the gentleman an extra 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
All this bill does is say, not as an afterthought, but as the cornerstone of the rulemaking process, the SEC simply understands the economic impact it's going to have, and there's a cost-benefit analysis done. It's a good bill, and I urge its passage. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I yield to the gentleman from Delaware, Representative Carney, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Delaware is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, ranking member, for your leadership on the efforts to strengthen the SEC and to beat back this legislation. As a member of the Financial Services Committee, I had the privilege yesterday of meeting the new SEC chairman, Mary Jo White. I was very impressed. I heard her describe her plans to take a tough, a fair, and an apolitical approach to regulating the financial sector. She wants to strengthen enforcement. She wants to oversee the markets through wise regulations that keep pace with technology. And she wants to complete the rulemaking process for Dodd-Frank, and we know how important each of those things are. She certainly has her work cut out for her, but it sounds like she knows just what the doctor ordered. Unfortunately, today's bill threatens to distract Chairman White from her efforts to protect investors and to protect our financial system from another crisis. Today's bill piles needless requirements and bureaucratic burdens on an agency that's already got too much to do and that it's underfunded. A critical part of the SEC's mission is protecting investors. This bill protects banks from regulation. It does nothing for investors. In fact, it could hurt investors in the long term. Chairman White has already committed to issuing rules in a thoughtful way that incorporates rigorous economic analysis. And she told us that yesterday. So the bill is also unnecessary. Regulating our financial sector and protecting American investors is a tall task as it is. We should be passing laws that make the SEC's job easier, not harder. We should be providing the SEC with the resources that it needs to do that job. And that's why I urge my colleagues to oppose today's legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I'd like to do a little factual cleanup here, Mr. Chairman, on some things that my Democratic colleagues have said. And I believe I understood my friend, the gentlelady from Wisconsin, to say nowhere in this bill is the word benefits. Well, first I would say, number one, it is a 10-page bill, not a 2,000-page bill. And on the very first page, line 11, you read the word benefits. If you turn to page 2, not page 2,000, page 2, line 3, utilize the chief economist to assess the cost and benefits. So let me correct that for the record. Second of all, we had discussion about the failure of regulation and how somehow this bill might lead to another great recession or financial crisis. I would point out to my friends that it was the failure to understand the cost of Fannie and Freddie, the failure to understand the cost of the affordable housing goals that put millions of our fellow citizens into homes that they could not afford to keep. I yield myself another minute. And so maybe, just maybe, had this body and the other body realized the full cost of their folly, and how it could not only bring this economy to its knees, that it could cause our fellow citizens to risk their meager life savings on homes they couldn't afford to keep. Maybe had a cost-benefit analysis been in place at that time, we wouldn't have the suffering that we have today. I would say to my friend from Connecticut, he is clearly talking to different economists and different job creators than I have, because what I understand from them is that, frankly, we have trillions of dollars of capital sitting on the sidelines because of Dodd-Frank. Because that we have rulemaking that falls into two categories, those that create uncertainty and those that create certain harm. Last but not least, I actually have the numbers from CBO on the budget of the SEC, and I think if you examine them carefully, Mr. Chairman, you will discover that in a little over 10 years, this is an agency whose budget has increased 300%.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Representative Foster, 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this bill. When my colleagues speak about the burdensome cost of regulations, I would like to remind them of the high costs of deregulation and inadequately funded regulators that we witnessed in 2008. This bill would increase the operating costs of the SEC without any increase in the agency's budget. Just yesterday, the chairman of the SEC warned the Financial Services Committee that this bill would divert resources from enforcing investor protections. And last year, former SEC Chairman Shapiro said that a nearly identical bill would, quote, significantly impede the SEC's ability to administer the securities laws. I would remind my colleagues that what the failure to administer the security laws and regulate our financial system has cost us. $16 trillion. That's the amount that families in America lost during the financial crisis. That is more than $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. During the financial crisis, in the last 18 months of the Bush administration, the average American family lost a quarter of its net worth. Compare that to the onset of the Great Depression, where families lost only about 12% of their net worth during a 5-year period. So by that measure, our last financial crisis was twice as big and twice as fast as the onset of the Great Depression. But the cost of inadequate regulation does not stop there. $1.6 billion, that's the amount that disappeared from customer accounts at MF Global in 2011. $17 billion, that's the amount that in 2009 Bernie Madoff was convicted of scamming investors out of. $1 trillion, that's the amount of wealth that disappeared and reappeared in less than 20 minutes during the flash crash in 2010. To put these figures in perspective, let's consider and compare them to bank robberies. Every year, banks lose $38 million to robberies. Yet we spend $24 billion every year on armed guards, vault doors, and FBI investigations. So for bank robberies, we spend 600 times more on prevention than on actual losses. Just imagine if we applied that same factor of 600 to investor losses from securities fraud and market manipulation. The budgets of our regulators would be hundreds of times larger than they are today. You know, the cynic in me can only conclude that what's really going on here is that the bank robbers just have really crummy lobbyists. But if we can spend 600 times the amount of actual losses to prevent bank robberies, why will my colleagues not support the President's request to spend 1/10,000th of the amount that families lost in the financial crisis on the SEC's annual budget? I challenge my colleagues who support this bill to commit to supporting the President's request to increase the SEC's budget. I remind them again of the high cost of inaction, which led to far too many of our constituents losing their homes, their retirement funds, and their small businesses a few years ago. By shortchanging the security of our financial markets, my colleagues are endorsing the same horizontal path. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill.
Mr. Chairman, I now proudly yield 1 minute to the distinguished majority leader, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to support the SEC Regulatory and Accountability Act of 2013. The American economy is hurting, and what we need is less government standing in the way of the private sector, not more. This act will bring about some common sense reforms by requiring the SEC to review existing regulations as well as preventing new and unnecessary ones that would only continue to slow economic growth and hurt businesses and families. With job growth struggling and our already having experienced several years of high unemployment, we've got to make certain that we are doing what we can to ensure that it's easier, not harder, for businesses to hire again. And this act will do just that by first clearly defining the root of a problem before trying to implement perhaps unjust and redundant burdens on America's businesses. This is an appropriate reform bill that should garner bipartisan support. The President's own Job Council has advocated regulatory reform by focusing on streamlining the current system for permitting projects that can create jobs. That Job Council understood that regulations involving the federal, state, and local level can lead to a tangled web of red tape and cause a bureaucratic nightmare. The current system will only continue to stunt economic growth, and this act is a much-needed step in the right direction. I'd like to thank the gentleman from New Jersey, Chairman Garrett, as well as the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, the gentleman from Texas, on their leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, I strongly support the passage of the bill, and I urge my colleagues in the House to do so as well. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentlelady from California seek?
I yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Representative David Scott, 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ranking Member Waters, for yielding. And ladies and gentlemen, I rise today to join my colleagues in strong opposition to H.R. 1062, the SEC Regulatory Accountability Act. Unfortunately, what we have before us today is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt at paralyzing an agency under the guise of an otherwise worthy activity, which is cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is a good thing to do, but not under the terms of this bill. Mr. Chairman, I don't think there's anybody in this body who's opposed to an honest, open, balanced, thorough, and truly objective cost-benefit analysis in the rulemaking process. On the contrary, we all agree that it is essential for creating good policy, as I said. However, the regime established in this bill is nothing but, rather, the assumption which would be codified into statute by this bill are worded in such a way as to prejudice the outcome of the analysis toward the side of not regulating at all in nearly every circumstance. And while some in this body may think that this is a good thing, ask the Americans who were victims of the latest financial meltdown, many of whom are still suffering because of it. Ask them what they think. Because the SEC, Mr. Chairman, is currently required to balance protection of investors with the maintenance of effective markets and efficient markets. This bill would do away with that balance by focusing solely on the cost to the industry and investor choice. Nowhere in the bill is investor protection, which is a part of the SEC's core mission, even mentioned at all. And moreover, I think it is crucial to point out that this bill also does nothing to ease the strain of the SEC's resources. Instead, it exacerbates the problem by slapping the SEC with a huge new administrative responsibility, all while they are still working furiously to implement Dodd-Frank and the Jobs Act without giving them the resources to accomplish the task. How on earth do my colleagues who support this bill think that the SEC can produce the type of analysis they're asking for, or any analysis at all for that matter, without the additional staff that even the GBO says they will be required to have? The problem is especially acute considering this bill would require going back and studying every rule in effect since the agency was first created way back in 1934. No other agency in the federal government is saddled with that kind of burden. Now I want to clear up some confusion between this bill and another cost-benefit bill that we're voting.
Reserves. The gentleman from Texas. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I yield myself 30 seconds to say to my friend from
The gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
Georgia, when he talks about the incredible burden of a retrospective look back, I would quote, "Because considerations of efficiency and competition and capital formation evolve over time, a retrospective analysis of the Commission's rules and regulations is fully within the Commission's statutory mandate." That comes from the ABA. I would also say, I will quote this as well, "The safety of workers' retirement savings that are invested in the capital markets depend in large part on the Commission's rules and regulations for the protection of the investors. To be effective, securities regulations must be continuously updated to address the emergence of new loopholes, abuses, market failures, AFL-CIO." Mr. Chairman, how much time is remaining on both sides?
The gentleman has 11 1/2 minutes remaining.
And the other side, Mr.
The gentlelady from California has 10 1/2 minutes remaining.
I'll reserve, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I yield to the gentleman from Washington, Representative Danny Heck, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Ranking Minority Member, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a different take on this. I rise to oppose this bill not because it seeks to and would effectively undermine the ability of the SEC to function, although it certainly does that. Instead, I want to speak to those who are laboring under the impression that this is good legislation and are conservatives, because it is not good legislation, and it is not rooted in conservative principles. Indeed, if red states tend to send more conservatives to this chamber, then they would respect their conservatism by lighting up red, every one of them, when we get to final passage. Conservatives don't pass unnecessary legislation. And yesterday, when we had the privilege of having Mary Jo White, the new chair of the SEC, before our committee, she was directly asked, is this legislation necessary? She was unanimously confirmed, applauded by both sides of the aisle, all philosophy. She said, not only is it unnecessary, it's undesirable. Conservatives don't enact unfunded mandates on state governments or local governments or on federal agencies. This is a massive unfunded mandate. And truly, and finally, true conservatives and a lot of the rest of us seek common sense regulatory relief, especially for community banks and credit unions, not additional, unnecessary, unfunded regulatory activity. And you know, Mr. Chair, we have several regulatory relief bills before our committee. Not yet scheduled, not yet heard. Congresswoman Capito has H.R. 1553 to grant some regulatory relief to community banks and credit unions. Let's vote 1062 down and get on to the work of those bills and grant real regulatory relief if we seek to support the SEC in its mission to protect investors and promote fair, orderly, and efficient markets. And, Mr. Chair, if you're a true conservative, you're going to vote no on 1062.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from California reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the author of the bill, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
I'm going to speak again until the fact that I was being lectured on but defined as what a true conservative is by the other side of the aisle, who gave us an over 2,000-page Dodd-Frank legislation that has in fact stymied the economy, despite what the gentleman from Connecticut was saying before, that is setting literally trillions of dollars on the side not being invested, that the unemployment rate hovers at high levels because of this stagnation in the economy, because of the legislation. To the other side of the aisle, if to define what a true conservative conservative is? A true conservative would actually read the bill, as the other members of the other side of the aisle have not done. Those who could not find simple words as benefit when it's listed multiple times. Those who could not find the benefits to investors when it's listed multiple times. A true conservative would understand what they're talking about when they come to the floor, Mr. Speaker. A true conservative would do what's in the best interest of the economy, of the investor, of the job seekers of this country as well. A true conservative would support this legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I would like unanimous consent to enter a number of communications into the record. I have a statement of administration policy from the Executive Office of the President. I have American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. I have Americans for Financial Reform. I also have AFSCME. And I also have California Public Employees Retirement System, all in opposition to this bill and asking us to please oppose the bill.
Gentlelady's request will be covered under general leave.
Mr. Speaker and members, a lot has been said in this debate.
Gentlelady is recognized for such time as she may consume.
A lot has been said about what this bill and what it is not, and I'd like to clear up a few of the points. First of all, before I go into clearing up some of these points, there's been, I guess, some back and forth here about what is and what is not a conservative. And I've always thought that the conservatives fashion themselves as saving money and reducing bureaucracy rather than creating legislation that costs more money and creates bureaucracy. So I guess today we see that perhaps I was wrong about what I thought a real conservative was. Let me go on to talk about the Republicans claiming that they are just codifying the President's executive order for more cost-benefit analysis. However, H.R. 1062 goes above and beyond the executive order by requiring the SEC to review all of its regulations, even those dating back to the Great Depression, within 1 year and then every 5 years after that. More bureaucracy, more money. While the executive order protects agencies from litigation over their economic analysis, H.R. 1062 would give Wall Street lobbyists and trades dozens of new avenues to sue the SEC over every rulemaking. Not only did they go into the courts on proxy access, there are two other bills, and I understand more that they're planning. It will cost the SEC more money to deal with this litigation and this bureaucracy. Importantly, H.R. 1062 would create confusion for the SEC because the bill requires the SEC to write rules that maximize the benefits even when Congress tells them otherwise. H.R. 1062 is not codifying the executive order, but is instead aimed squarely at undermining Wall Street's cop on the block. In writing the rules, the SEC is required to balance both investor protection and capital formation. One cannot take precedence over the other. I've heard a lot of talk about capital formation here today, but they, in bringing this bill to the floor, are creating more bureaucracy and piling up more burdens and responsibility so that they impede the ability to do real capital formation. And so, in addition to easing the ability of small companies to enter the public markets, the SEC has done much to make it easier for companies to raise the money they need privately. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'm under the impression I have the right to close, so the gentlelady has reserved. I will reserve until she is ready to close.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. What purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, how many minutes do I have left?
The gentlelady has 6 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much. In closing, allow me to quote one of the Financial Services Committee members in a hearing yesterday, because I think it is so important for us to understand that the SEC is our cop on the block who has responsibility for protecting investors. Let us understand that my colleagues on the opposite side of the aisle is opposed to the SEC having an adequate budget. They do everything that they can to cut the budget, to deny the resources, but they keep adding on additional responsibilities, recognizing that the SEC has a tremendous load. Not only do they have all of the work, the cost-benefit analysis that they do on everything, but they have the responsibility of rulemaking for all of Dodd-Frank, which is the reform legislation that will cause us to eliminate risk and to protect our constituents and the citizens of this country. But let me just say that yesterday during a Financial Services Committee hearing, Chairman Emeritus Spencer Backer said that it would be penny-wise and pound-foolish for there not to be a bipartisan agreement for raising the funding or increasing the funding for the SEC. And I think that's important to get out there. They need more resources. And while we have this bill that's costing them more money to simply implement what they would like to do in 1062, they oppose in giving additional resources. In addition to that, let's talk about this court action. We mentioned early on that the SEC had been taken to court on proxy access. What are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that the institutional investors, the ones who are responsible for investing the money so that the workers, the public workers, the firemen, the police, the teachers, all can have adequate retirement. And so our institutional investors wanted very much to ensure that the companies that they're investing in are managing these funds well, and they simply wanted the ability to place proxy access into the proxy materials so that they could nominate directors to the board to make sure that they're overseeing the money for all of our first responders and our employees. Well, my friends on the opposite side of the aisle teamed up with Wall Street, and they went to court, and they made this big case, and it was right here in Washington, D.C., in the district court, and they got an opinion, they got a ruling, and so the SEC went back, and it said basically to everybody, all of its employees, what have you, let's do even more. And on top of them, not only saying let's do more, and instructing the employees to do more, then they come with this bill and want to put more on top of that. This is not about those people that Mr. Henselman referred to around the kitchen table talking about jobs. This is about protecting Wall Street. This is about tying up the SEC. This is about making sure the SEC is not able to carry out its responsibilities. This, again, is about putting us all at risk. This is about not being about the investors, but being about the markets. This, again, is about protecting those who really need no protection, those who placed us at risk to begin with, those who not only placed us at risk, but would do it again if we allow them to do it. I don't know why. Why would my friends on the opposite side of the aisle would be opposed to something like proxy access and then lined up in the courts again with other litigation that's going to take away precious dollars from the SEC that they need to protect us, to protect the investors. But no, they come to this floor and they simply describe this bill in ways that it really is not. This is dangerous. It is irresponsible. It is not something that the people of this country would expect of people that they send to Congress to represent them. This is, again, and we'll say it over and over again, as it has been said by so many who have come here and testified today on this side of the aisle. This is about protecting Wall Street. This is about protecting those who simply want to find ways to keep the SEC from stopping them in their rulemaking from doing things that will be harmful to the American public. And so, Mr. Chairman and members, I say to you, we should all stop and think about this. And for all those who are listening, all of the members on both sides of the aisle, we should think about our responsibility here today and understand what this bill is all about, and vote no, a resounding no on this bill. Let us make sure that people are not saying a few years from now, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I should not have tied the hands of the SEC. I should have been more careful. I should not have listened to what was being said by the very people who caused us the problem in the first place. I think if our members stop and they listen and they pay attention, that they're going to oppose this bill, even some on the opposite side of the aisle. And I think some of them know this. They know that they're being asked to support something that may not be in the best interest of their constituents, but they might want to go along with the leadership. But it's not time to go along with leadership. It's time to be independent. It's time to look at the facts and vote no on this bill.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas. First, the gentleman from Texas rise.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman has 10½ minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Although I'll alert my colleagues, I do not intend to take it all. Mr. Chairman, I find it somewhat interesting at the great amount of wailing and gnashing of teeth that we have heard on this House floor for a very simple bill that weighs in at, frankly, less than 10 pages. It simply requires a government agency to decide, is there going to be a cost to our economy? Is there going to be a loss of jobs as they pass a rule? Doesn't overturn their rules. It just says before you make a rule, you really got to think about kitchen table economics. You got to take a look and understand how will this ultimately impact hardworking Americans who are struggling to pay their health care bills, struggling to put gas in the tank, who have economic insecurity due to this economy. And so I've heard a lot of furor here. I must admit I'm particularly entertained by those who care to lecture me on what it means to be a conservative. Maybe I'm not the world's expert, but there was a time in my career my fellow colleagues elected me the chairman of the conservative caucus of the House, known as the Republican Study Committee. And Mr. Chairman, I have a certificate in my office that I proudly display from the Americans for Democratic Action, where they said Congressman Hensarling receives a 0% liberal rating. So I will certainly agree with my friends that apparently I don't know much about liberalism, but I do think I do know a few things about conservatism, so I'll come up with an informal agreement. We'll let you be the experts on what it means to be a liberal, and you're very good at it, to the best of my knowledge. I will retain the expertise on how one votes conservative. The next thing I would say, Mr. Chairman, is how fascinating it is to have so many of my colleagues say that this bill on the one hand is unnecessary, but on the other it's burdensome. On the one hand it's redundant, on the other hand it will stop the SEC in its tracks. You know, Mr. Chairman, I just don't think you can quite have it both ways. And I notice when some can't argue the merits of a question, they tend to come up with question one's motivation, and we've got the usual Wall Street boogeymen to come in here. But you know what I want to know about is why would we not want to know, as some have estimated, that the Volcker rule promulgated by the SEC potentially could cost 1.1 million jobs in our nation. And yet, my colleagues from the other side of the aisle says, shh, no, we don't want this information. We don't want it out. Just like we didn't want out the information that Obamacare could cost us 1 million jobs. And we see it every day. We get the headlines. People can't afford their health care. Their premiums have gone up. People are getting laid off. People who had full-time jobs are going to part-time. People who would have hired more people don't want to cross that 50-person threshold, and that's just Obamacare. But no, shh, We don't want to know how this is going to impact hard-working Americans who have economic insecurity, millions who do not have jobs. I mean, I'm somewhat perplexed, Mr. Chairman, how such a simple bill says all you got to do is look at the cost. We're not imposing our numbers on them. We're just saying you gotta look at the cost of what you do. It's what families do. It's what job creators do. And frankly, it's what the administration claimed they wanted to do. It's what the SEC claimed they wanted to do. How many of my Democratic colleagues with their words say yes, but very soon with their voting card are going to say no? No, we shouldn't know the cost of rulemaking. No, we just want to know what the bureaucrats say the benefits are. But, you know, if people lose their jobs, well, okay, sirrah, we just aren't going to, we don't want to know that ahead of time. Maybe we'll learn about it afterwards. Maybe we'll try to clean up the pieces, the shattered lives of people who lost their jobs. You know, Mr. Chairman, this is a false dichotomy set up by many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. The question is not between regulation and deregulation. The question is between smart regulation and dumb regulation. And smart regulation requires the rule makers to understand the cost of their rules to the average hard-working American family. That's smart regulation. Dumb regulation is burying your head in the sand and saying, no, we don't want to know. And if we're so concerned about the burden on the SEC, if we're so concerned about the litigation burden, and if we're so concerned about the work burden and the rule burden, where's this same concern for the job creators of America? Where is that concerned? You cannot help the job seeker by punishing the job creator, which is what so many of the different titles of Dodd-Frank do. So at the end of the day, Mr. Chairman, this is as simple and as common sense as it could be. If you're going to pass a rule and you're going to tell us about the benefits, you got to let us know what the costs are. To the economy, to hardworking American families, it's common sense. We should adopt it. We should adopt it today. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. It shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-10. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in House Report 113-60. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed